Hey everybody, thanks for joining Dustin and myself for Tuesday Night Live. We are on the third week of the signs or miracles in the Gospel of John, the 7 that he includes in his Gospel. So tonight we're going to be in John chapter 5, starting at verse 1, and I'm looking forward to tonight.
I'm excited about this sign, this particular sign, because I think it raises, or not raises, but it answers a lot of questions of physical need versus spiritual need.
Mm-hmm.
And we see Jesus doing a lot of physical healings for people, showing compassion in their time of need. But what we're going to learn at the end of this story is why he's doing that,
Yeah.
and what it's pointing to,
Mm-hmm.
and that's to be holy.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. I agree.
I really like this story for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is going to be a good story tonight. We're going to try to get through this as quick as we can, just to keep you informed. We have an elders meeting tonight about reopening, kind of setting those plans and getting ready for that. So we're looking, Dustin and I are both looking for that later on tonight, and that plan hopefully could be coming out to you later in the week. But we're going to dive right in to John chapter 5, starting at verse 1. And man, this is an awesome miracle, an awesome sign that we're going to be talking about. So do you care to read the first three verses there?
After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, a pool, in Aramaic, called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed.
Yeah. So we kind of pick up the story, and we don't know how much time has elapsed. That's one of the things when you read through stories like this, and you read through the book of Acts and in the Gospels, is there's a time lapse that you don't realize when you're reading it, and you got to kind of figure that out. But Jesus enters Jerusalem, and there's a feast going on. There's a holy time going on for the Jewish people. And it's not explicit as to what holy time this is. So, in my humble opinion, I think this is the Feast of Tabernacles. Not that that's really vital to the story, but I think that this is the Feast of Tabernacles because we're going to see the Passover come in the next few chapters. We're going to see then the Feast of Tabernacles happen again later. That's my guess, but there's a lot of speculation on that. But a couple things as we go through the first 3 verses. Number 1 is this. Bethesda, it could be a different name for the pool in your translation. It depends on your translation. There's the Bethsaida, Bethesda are the 2 main translations, I believe. Bethesda is probably the better translation. And Bethesda means house of mercy. Have you ever heard of a hospital named Bethesda?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Hospitals are named Bethesda. They're houses of mercy. And you can see that in our world, and maybe some hospitals are named because of this story, right? But it's also because of the name Bethesda. What Bethesda means, it means house of mercy. And then we see Jesus. There's a pool, right? And that's the Bethesda pool. It's by the sheep gate. The sheep gate is off of, I believe, the north side of Jerusalem, where the sacrificial animals would enter into Jerusalem, and they would take them and they would sacrifice them. That gate right there. Jesus actually calls himself the sheep gate in John chapter 10, right? He says, I'm the gate. I'm the way in which you enter and you have pasture, right? Jesus is the gate. That's a great point just to make. Yeah. But the pools are actually very well attested. Archaeological evidence has actually found these 5 colonnades, these 5 pillars, and there's actually 2 pools side by side here. This one is called Bethesda. This one pool right here is called Bethesda, and there's columns with a roof over it where invalids are laying, paralyzed people are laying. These people are laying there waiting for something to happen, right? Waiting for mercy to happen in this house of mercy. Notice with me, this is one thing that you got as you look through translations. Notice that you go from verse 3 to verse 5. Okay, you go from verse 3 to verse 5. That is because translation has become better.
Yeah.
Over the years, translation has actually become much better. Verse 4 is not in the earliest manuscript evidence. So we right now have like almost 6,000 manuscripts, right? Some of them very small, some of them very large, of the Bible or the New Testament. And the earliest manuscripts don't have verse 4. Verse 4 says something like this: an angel of the Lord would come down and stir the waters. And the first one in the water would be healed, which is why these invalids are laying there. And I'm not saying that tradition is not true. It's just not in the earliest manuscripts. And that's why, like, the ESV is going to skip that verse. It's going to have a footnote. I think the NIV has a footnote. All these newer translations, because the manuscript evidence doesn't support keeping verse 4. That's just something to keep in mind. That happens a variety of times throughout the New Testament. You'll go from verse 8 to verse 10, and you're like, where's verse 9? It's been taken out because it wasn't in the most original manuscript that we have. That's just a short version of why that's not there. But so we're going to pick it up in verse 5. Anything on the first 3 verses you have?
I think that it's important to realize that Jesus is on a very intentional schedule.
Yeah.
With where he's going and where he's visiting.
Absolutely.
And what he's doing.
I
And
agree.
by this time, correct me if I'm wrong, but people are starting to talk about Jesus.
Yeah.
And if you look in some of the other Gospels, you see even John the Baptist writes about asking him if he's the Messiah and different things. So people are starting to talk about Jesus, and this is kind of one of those signs that happen that kind of made people go, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Like they all kind of have that feel to it. But this one here kind of, I guess you could say, maybe gets the ball rolling as far as the leaders.
We're going to see that in
religious
a few
leaders
verses for sure.
Coming in. And
so
then,
another thing to highlight on your topic is what you just said, is that Jesus is hiding who he is, especially in the Gospel of Mark, right? You read through the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is hiding who he is. And we'll see that a little bit in this story.
yes.
That Jesus is still kind of not ready to put his full identity out there, right?
Because there were still more signs that needed to happen.
Absolutely, but it does come out in this story.
Yes,
so,
I think there were more signs that needed to happen, and he knew that, and he knew putting himself out there too early would put himself. He knew that the cross was coming.
Yeah.
But he knew that it had to happen at a specific time.
Yeah.
So his
He
timing.
had some more ministry to do.
Yeah, it was very, very specific.
Agreed.
And then I just wanted to point out the water thing, the water in the pool. You know, we could look at multiple signs and wonders, and we go back and see that water, that healing, the healing from the water. There's just another example of that.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's pick it up in verse 5. All right. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me." The question in verse 6 gets me every single time, right? This man has been laying here, maybe not laying in this one spot, obviously, but this man has been an invalid for 38 years. 38 right? Years. That's a long time first. Most people don't even live to be 38 in Jesus' time. I mean, we're talking about people dying in their teens and stuff. This guy's been laying here for 38 years, and he's older than 38. I think the insinuation in the whole entire story is this man is even older than 38. He's just been invalid for 38. Okay? And we'll get to that in a little bit. But he looks at this man and he says, "Do you want to be healed?" I don't know what your thoughts are after he says that, but I think there's a dramatic pause here.
My initial reaction is, yeah, of course. Why would this guy not want to be healed? But
exactly.
Then when you kind of look into it a little bit, you're like, and I think we'll find that out here more in the as we go through the scripture. But it's a little more intentional question than that. It's kind of goes back to that sign. What's it pointing to? Because the sign points to something else.
Yeah, I got you. So
sure. He's kind of pointing toward. I don't want to give it away right now.
Yeah.
He's pointing towards something else.
Absolutely, I agree.
Besides the
100%.
physical need.
I think every miracle that Jesus does, yes, he cares about the physical need, but there's more to it than that.
Yes.
All the time. And one thing to note too is the word healing, or in other miracles, Jesus says, do you want to be made well? There's something way more than just, oh, I want to be able to walk again. No, Jesus is pointing to something spiritual there too. The whole word well means being let back in the community. All these variety of different things. There's more than just the physical healing. Jesus is trying to do something else for sure.
Yes.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. But I think this man, like, after Jesus asked that question, he just pauses for a second. He's just like if Jesus
like
asked
you
me
or
that,
I would,
yeah,
like,
really? In your mind, you're going, really? You're asking me this question right now. And then he answers in this way. And notice this man has a pattern. I think he has a pattern of blaming other people for his problems. We'll see this again later. But look at what this guy says. Sir, I have nobody's willing to put me in the pool. Like, he starts to blame it on other people. All these people are willing to walk past me, and they're not willing to put me in the pool. And he starts to blame his problems on other people. We do that often. Yeah. That's one practical thing to take from this. He's diverting the blame. And then he says, and the other people, they get in there before me. And so he's blaming it on the people who won't put him in the pool, possibly. He's blaming it on the other invalids who are faster than him. And he's blaming it on God somewhat too. Yeah. That God just doesn't want to heal me. He doesn't want me to be well. All this variety of stuff is going into this. But this man has a pattern of blaming his problems on other people. And I think this should be, in this story, we should look at this man and go, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to blame all of my problems on other people. Yeah. And we'll see that later on in the story. Anything to add there?
Not yet.
I think he's definitely diverting blame. And we'll see this again in verse 11. He diverts blame twice in this story. He diverts blame. Go ahead and pick it up, verse 8.
Verse 8. Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed. And he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'"
Yeah. A lot in these three verses. There's a lot I want to focus on.
I like how you cut that off at 11 instead of 12.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot in this. Every time Jesus, like when Jesus heals somebody, there's often these times where he gets caught up in this controversy. And this is why I think in the Gospel of Mark, he's going, hold on, I'm trying to hide myself. I'm trying to hide who I am. This story, he's about to get caught up in a controversy that is going to cause, if you want to cause an uproar, especially among the religious leaders. And it's this almost always the same controversy, Sabbath controversy. Yeah. Jesus is caught up in Sabbath controversy over and over and over again.
And Jesus is not here. Jesus is not doing these things to like entertain people. Like, hey, everybody, this is me. Look what I can do.
Yeah, he's not.
So he's not doing that. Again, he's pointing to something greater.
Yeah. And so Jesus is about to get caught up in a Sabbath controversy. And remember, this is a feast, a holy day. So this may not be the actual Sabbath, but a holy day is treated as a Sabbath. It's a no work. The Jewish people take the Sabbath so serious. And we don't do it. We don't take the Sabbath near as serious as we should now. Right. And I'm not talking about Sundays. I'm just talking about a Sabbath. I'm talking about rest. I'm talking about just pausing from work, all those variety of things. But the Jewish people took it so serious. It's said that Jewish people counted the laws in the Old Testament at 615 or so. But in regards to the Sabbath, there's 2,000 laws that they regard just for the Sabbath. They took the Sabbath so serious. And they actually ended up making more rules than the Bible even says. Right? They began to protect themselves by adding to this so that they don't break the Sabbath because the Sabbath is holy. Right? They begin to add stuff to it. And I think this rule right here that they're so mad about is a made up rule that's not in the Old Testament. There is talk in the Old Testament about not carrying a load, but that's not talking about your bed mat. That's talking about actual work, carrying something to go sell, carrying something for your work or your occupation. You're not supposed to do that on the Sabbath.
Right.
Now, picking up your bed and just holding your bed and walking, is that really what God meant about the Sabbath?
No.
I don't believe that at all. So Jesus is about to get caught up in a human Sabbath tradition that is not explicit in the Old Testament. Okay? He's about to get caught up in that. Notice, I love verse 11. Notice verse 11, what happens in verse 11. Right? But the man, he answered them, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. I love it for a couple reasons. Number one, we should always follow Christ's command.
Yes.
We have been healed. As a Christian, I have been healed by Christ. I think about the book of Isaiah. By his wounds, you are healed. That as a Christian, I have been healed by Christ. My sin and my shame and the punishment that goes along with that has been taken on by Christ. And so now I follow his commands. He's my Lord, right? And this man is kind of saying that without even knowing what he's saying.
He, without even realizing it, he understands and obeys his authority.
Exactly. Absolutely.
And when he says that to these religious leaders, like, he has the authority, not these man-made rules. Okay? I think that leads us into what's coming next in the next verses.
Yeah. I agree. And so I don't want to say the Old Testament laws are man-made, but this one's man-made.
Yeah.
This carry your bed is not explicit in the Old Testament. And so this man says, that guy told me, he healed me, and he told me to take my bed and walk. So that's what I did, right? That's number one. Jesus has healed us. We need to listen to Jesus. We need to obey what Jesus says. And so many people in our world, I feel like I'm talking 100 miles a minute because I'm getting excited.
Yeah.
So many people in our world, they love the fact that Jesus has healed them. He's taken their sin. He's taken the punishment of eternity away from God for them, right? He's made a way for them to be in a relationship with God. They love that fact, but they don't want to follow his commands.
Right.
This man is healed, and he follows Jesus' commands. And when the religious leaders come, he goes, that guy told me to do this, right? He has authority to heal me, and he has authority to tell me what to do, right? Now, verse 11 is also another time in which this guy reverts blame. Once again, he doesn't say, it's my fault, I'm carrying my mat. He goes back to what he said earlier. They wouldn't put me in the pool, or they were too fast for me. Now he's going, he's pointing his finger, that guy told me, and he can't find Jesus. He can't find Jesus. Jesus has left. Jesus has kind of sneaked off into the crowd. He doesn't even know who healed him.
Yeah.
But he's following his command. And so he starts to revert blame back to Jesus and saying, well, he told me to do it. So he doesn't want to take blame for anything in his life. He doesn't want to take the criticism. He wants to divert blame to other people. I love the fact that he was obedient to Christ's command.
Yes.
But he's not willing to ever take the blame for himself. And we're going to see that later on when Jesus says something to him in these next verses. All right? Let's pick it up right in verse 12. Right in verse 12. They asked him, who is this man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. I'm going to stop there for a second. This kind of goes back to the theme in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus, he doesn't want to take credit. And he kind of hides his message, right? Hides the fact that he's the one that healed the man. He kind of snuck off into the crowd. Jesus has a tendency of doing this because he doesn't want to draw too much attention to himself yet, because he knows the attention is going to lead to the cross. And he's still got ministry to do, right? Absolutely. Verse 14 is really an important verse as we look at this story. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple, and he said to him, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Right?
It's a lot in that verse.
That verse is slam packed, and we're going to spend some time. Let's just spend some time on that verse, right?
I'll start off with.
Go ahead.
I'll start off with my thought for verse 12.
Yep.
Is they, being the religious leaders, they ask him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?"
Yep.
And I think that's very telling to their thoughts, their views, and their attitudes toward what just happened, because they know this guy had been laying there for years, and they're not even willing to admit that he's healed
or be excited about it.
So instead of them saying, "Who healed you?" they instead of asking that question, they ask him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?"
Yeah, that's a great point to make. Like
they won't even say, "Who healed you?"
Absolutely. As you read through commentaries, they highlight that point. The religious leaders were not even excited for this man. They had no compassion.
Right.
None. This guy's been laying for 38 years, paralyzed, an invalid. Now he's healed, and you know it. You know it. You know it. And you don't even mention that at all. All you're worried about is him carrying a mat.
Yeah. Worried about the law.
Exactly. That goes back to the problem with the religious leaders, that they had no compassion for people. Goes back to the parable of the Good Samaritan. Mm-hmm. What did the religious leader do? They passed by on the other side of the road. All these different stories in Jesus' teachings, the religious leaders had no compassion for people. Jesus did. Yeah. That's a great point to make. They literally don't even ask him about his miracle.
They don't
care. They don't care about that. What they care about is, oh, you're carrying your bed. What? You're missing the point. This man has been healed. You should be excited about that, for sure. Great point. Now, what sticks out to me is verse 14. A couple things in verse 14.
Oh, yeah.
Right? He says, "See, you are well." The word "well," it's more than just, oh, you're able to walk again. No, you're well. You've been made whole. Right? You've been made whole. You've been restored. That kind of idea. Now, look at verse 14 too. "Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you."
I think
this brings up a lot of thoughts.
I think that a lot of people might take this as, like, if you sin, something bad will happen to you.
Absolutely.
And that's not correct.
Not always correct.
Not always. It's not always correct.
Yes, absolutely.
If I go out and do something stupid, there is an act or reaction to my action.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's consequence to sin.
Yes.
But I think that he's again pointing to something else.
Absolutely, I think so too. I think so. First thing I want to highlight. Other times Jesus encounters people who, let's say the blind man. He encounters the blind man, and people are going, "Well, what sin did he commit or his parents that he was born blind?" Remember this story?
Yeah.
Right? And Jesus says he didn't sin, and his parents didn't sin to cause this. He was born blind so that I could heal him. Right? Yeah. That idea. Now, so things that are physical illnesses that happen to us are not always caused by sin. They just happen in the world we live in today. It's caused by Genesis chapter 3, but it's not caused by my sin. Think about the story of Job. Did Job's friends, all the time, Job's friends are saying, "What did you do? What did you do? What did you do?" And God is sitting back the whole time going, "Job didn't do anything. I'm testing Job." Right? Satan is doing these things to him because God has allowed it. But the whole time, Job's friends keep saying, "What did you do?" Job didn't do anything. Job did not do anything. His faith was being tested. And God allowed Satan to do that to stuff to him, right? But Job didn't do anything. Now, in other circumstances, though, physical ailments are caused by our sin, right? And so I want to highlight this. I think, reading through this story, I think this guy's illness, he was an invalid, I think this guy's illness or condition was caused by sin, right? I think this is one of those instances. Now, do we know that for sure? No, but I think that's what verse 14 is talking about in some degree. That something this guy did caused his condition in his former life. Now, that's not always the case, okay? I want to make sure I say that. That's not always the case. Sometimes people get cancer, it just happens, okay? Yeah. Other times, you've smoked for 20 years and you caused it. Both are true. Okay? Now, I think in this scenario, this guy had sinned in his past, and that sin most likely caused his condition. Okay? Now, so all physical problems or diseases are not brought by sin, but some are. And we need to live our lives. God sets up these rules and these boundaries and these things for us to follow to keep us safe, to protect us. And we need to listen to them. So when I think Jesus says sin no more or something worse may happen to you, I think in one sense Jesus is saying, you know that sin caused what happened to you before. Don't do that again. Right?
Correct.
But in another sense, what could be worse than 38 years of laying under a colonnade, a roof, waiting to be healed? What could be worse than that?
Eternal judgment.
Eternal judgment, absolutely. So both can be true at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? Eternal judgment. I can think of almost nothing in terms of physical illness that could be worse than being paralyzed for 38 years. I really cannot think of anything that could be worse than that.
Yep.
So Jesus is pointing to eternal life, and he's saying, look, you're well. But don't just use your wellness to sin.
Right.
Right? Don't just use this miracle as an opportunity to sin no more. I think about Romans chapter 6. When it says, do we just sin so that grace can abound? And Paul emphatically says, by no means, right? I think this man now, because he's well, has more opportunity to sin. And Jesus is looking at him and saying, don't use this healing as an opportunity to go and sin.
To go and live life.
However you want to live it.
However you want to live it.
Absolutely.
On your own agenda.
Absolutely.
Because if you do,
eternal judgment.
Eternal judgment.
Something worse may happen to you. I think that's the point, right? That's the point. So how often could this guy sin if he's an invalid? Less often than we can, right? That's kind of the point that I think Jesus is making. Now you're well, you have more opportunity to sin, but don't do it because something worse can happen to you.
Yep.
What are your thoughts?
Didn't he say something similar to that? To the
John chapter 8, I think, the woman who committed adultery.
Right? The woman who committed adultery. Yes.
I mean, I think he said to her, "Go and sin no more."
Wrote in the dirt.
Yes, absolutely. Now that's a very highly contested.
I know.
Passage of
when I
scripture.
brought it up, I knew.
You're going to see a note there in your Bible about that story, but let me make sure that that's the right story.
Pretty sure it is.
Yes, he looks at her at the end of that story in verse 11 and he says, go, and from now on, sin no more. Okay? Sin no more. Okay, so yeah, he does. He says that twice. Maybe that would be an argument for John chapter 8 actually being considered, but it's not in some of the earliest manuscripts.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's another rabbit hole.
Sorry.
Okay? So, but yeah, he does. And so I think what we need to take from this is this. Let's not use our freedom. Let's not use our wellness. Let's not use the abilities that we have for opportunities to sin, because there is eternal judgment. And it's much worse than being paralyzed for 38 years. We're talking about eternal separation away from God forever. And Jesus is highlighting that point to this man. Don't just use this newfound ability to just keep on sinning. Don't do it.
Something that just came to my mind, and I hope I can articulate it, but if you look at kind of how this story unfolds, we see basically Jesus breaking a man-made rule.
Yeah.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So then we see Jesus perform this miracle on the Sabbath. It's breaking this man-made rule. So it's almost like Jesus is doing this on purpose, but then he's going right back and saying, just because I did this doesn't mean you can just go do whatever you want to do.
Absolutely. I think that's true. That's a good point, for sure. Yeah. Doesn't mean you just go out and break all the rules and do whatever you want.
Right.
Just because I did this for you.
Yeah.
Right? Absolutely. And I think that's kind of the gospel story. That when I come to know Jesus, I'm free. and I preached this a few weeks ago, like when I come to know Jesus, I have freedom. I'm not bound by a lot of things, right? I have this freedom, but I don't use that as an opportunity to just sin. I use it as an opportunity to follow Christ because he healed me, right?
With freedom comes great responsibility.
Absolutely. It does. Absolutely. I think those are all good points. This verse 14 is the best verse, I think, in this whole passage. It gets me every single time I read it. All right, let's keep on going and finish up the story here. Starting at verse 15, it says, the man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. Once again, some commentators think when Jesus says, go and sin no more, he's talking about, don't go tell the Jewish people what I did, because he foresees verse 15 happening.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's an overstep maybe, but could be a possibility. But this guy just immediately, what's he do? He goes and tells them who healed him. Like, why? All right, but anyways, verse 16, and this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. Yeah.
That's huge.
I think verse 18 should be included in this story, right? I think verse 18 should be included in this story. But we'll read verse 18 in a minute. Verse 17 is huge. My Father is working until now, and I am working.
What a play on words.
Absolutely.
It's brilliant.
It's a play on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
It's such a play on Genesis chapter 1.
Yeah.
It's a play on the Sabbath. Jesus is drawing us back to Genesis chapter 1. Okay? We know Genesis chapter 1. God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. Okay? And he rested on the seventh. Now, whether or not those are literal days, all that stuff doesn't mean anything. Okay? What he's talking, he's pointing us back to Genesis 1, and he's saying, God didn't need to rest on the seventh day. The rest wasn't for God, right?
It was for us.
It was for you. The Sabbath was made for you as a human being. God established this system of working and resting and working and resting and working and resting, and the work is good, but the rest is good. The Sabbath was for your benefit, right? The Father's been working all this time. The Father has been working all of this time. The Sabbath was for your benefit as a human being made in the image of God. He wanted you to rest in him, right? All the Sabbath means is to stop. God literally wanted you to stop, pause, and just rest in the fact that he created the heavens and the earth, and he created you, and then the wonderful person that God is. He wanted you to stop, right? And so Jesus is pointing us back to Genesis 1, and he's saying the Sabbath wasn't made for God. The Sabbath was made for you. And Jesus says this multiple times, okay? Now, what I also think 17 says is, look what he says. He says, my Father is working until now, and I am working. So what did he just say? I and the Father, we're one.
We're the same.
Yeah, we're one.
Not the same.
Yeah.
The same.
Yeah. We're one. The Father is in me and I am in the Father. We're one. What the Father is doing, I'm doing.
And he doesn't say,
right?
And now I am working.
Yeah.
He's
we're
saying
both working.
We're working together in community.
Yes, absolutely. And when you see me do something, that's also the Father doing it, right? When I do something, I'm doing it because the Father and I are one, and because the will of the Father is for me to do this. Whatever the Father wants me to do, that's what I do. Jesus says that often. But he's saying, I am the Son of God. I am the Messiah. I am the Christ. I am deity. I am divine. He is equating himself with God the Father. Yeah. Notice he uses Father. I don't think, and this may be an overstep, but I don't think Jesus is like the first one to come on the scene and ever use the word Father in terms of God. In terms of God. So Jesus is saying, basically he's saying, I'm a part of the Godhead. The Father and I are one, right? That's what he's saying. And man, this is ultimately why Jesus dies. Right? This is ultimately why Jesus dies, is that Jesus is time and time again equating himself with God. Maybe subtly to us, but it's not subtly to the first century reader. It's not subtle to the Jewish people. They immediately catch this. Every time Jesus says one of these things where we may miss it because we're centuries later and we're not Jewish people.
Right.
They don't miss it. Never do they miss it. Look at verse 18. I think verse 18 should be included as we look at this story. Because I think verse 18 stems from verse 17. Right? It stems from that. Read verse 18. I love it.
This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God.
Bam. Right?
Yeah.
Yes, Jesus breaking the Sabbath made the religious leaders very upset. Absolutely. They considered the Sabbath and the laws on the Sabbath so important. But what ultimately made them more upset was the fact that Jesus called God his Father. Okay? And when you think about a father-son relationship, especially in terms of inheritance, especially in terms of they're one. They're equals. They're right. Jesus is saying, I and the Father were one. And this is, look at verse 18. This is, John tells us explicitly, this is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill Jesus. This is why Jesus ultimately dies on the cross, because he equates himself with God. Yes, he breaks the Sabbath, which makes them upset. Yes, he breaks a lot of the old, or in their eyes, he breaks the Old Testament rules. But he's not breaking the rules. He's fulfilling them. We know that. That's what Jesus says. But he equates himself with the Father. That's ultimately why Jesus dies on the cross. Right? I love the way C.S. Lewis says this. C.S. Lewis says that we have three options in terms of who Christ is. Because remember, he says he is God. He's either a liar, and he's just making all this up, which is awful, right? It's awful. He's a lunatic, meaning he's a nutcase, right? Yeah. I mean, I just watched Waco, the Netflix series, right, on David Koresh, who basically said he's the Messiah. He's the Son of God. That dude was a lunatic. I mean, he was nuts, right? He was a little crazy. So either Jesus is a liar, a lunatic, or he is Lord. I love to play on the L's. Yeah. Liar, lunatic, or Lord. One of those three, that's who Jesus is. We cannot say Jesus is just a good teacher. He lived a good life. He had a lot of good principles. The dude said he was God. Yeah. So either he's a liar, he's a lunatic, or he is my Lord. Pick. Right? That's what C.S. Lewis says. And so in this story, we see that Jesus is equating himself with God. Jesus is saying that your physical ailments, they can be caused by sin. And if they were, don't do that again. Jesus is saying he wants to heal us. And once he heals us, we need to follow his command. Yeah. And Jesus is saying there's something worse than being an invalid for 38 years. It's called eternal judgment, separation from God for all of eternity. And we need to have that on our mind. Any closing thought there?
Just one thing that I kind of missed as we were going over the scripture, and if you give me a second, I'll find it. In verse 8, it says, Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And in verse 9, it says, "And at once the man was healed. And he took up his bed and walked." Mm-hmm. Now that day was the Sabbath. But I want you to pay attention to "and at once" in verse 9.
Yeah.
The man was healed. And I guess in my closing remarks on this entire story is that Jesus has compassion on his people. And whether you receive a physical healing or not, you need spiritual healing more than you need anything. Because the greater consequence is that eternal judgment. Mm-hmm. And when Jesus heals you, it happens immediately. Yeah. And when it happens immediately, you know it happens. And you can't help but want to pick up your bed and walk and follow him and do the things that he has called you to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just like last week's story.
Yeah.
The man asked what time his son was better. It happened.
Yeah.
It happens immediately.
Yeah. And so, yeah, forgiveness of sins happened immediately.
Yeah.
That's your point. Yeah. Like when you put your faith and trust in Jesus, he forgives your sin immediately.
You don't have to work for it. You
Yeah.
don't have to.
Absolutely.
It's a gift. It's
Mm-hmm.
freely given. And when you can understand that,
yeah, then you want to live for him.
Then you want to live for him.
Absolutely.
You want to pick up your bed. You want to go and tell people.
That's a great point.
About
for sure.
Jesus. It's
Yeah.
like a.
Absolutely.
Instead, oftentimes we think that we have to. Well, I got to do this, and I got to do this, and I got to do this, and I got to do this. Just like the religious people.
Yeah.
In the story.
Yeah.
And it happens immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the fact that oftentimes people love to play on the fact that you need to have faith. You need to have faith. That's what makes you well. Jesus doesn't say that to this man.
Yeah.
He literally just looks at him and says, "Get up. I'm making you well." Right? And after he is made well, after Jesus says this, then he gets up and he walks. Right? He doesn't have to believe it before. So in your life, you could have been an atheist before then, but all of a sudden come to encounter Jesus and go, "I was wrong." Right?
Yes.
You don't have. I was like, there's this. You could have done anything in your past, but when you truly come to encounter Jesus and he touches you, like he touches you, from that you just get up and you move forward with him. And this also proves that miracles are not always based on my faith, the invalid's faith. It's based on who Jesus is.
Right.
Right? And a lot of modern miracle movements, they say, you need to believe. If you don't believe, it's not happening. But even the disciples, they do that too. That's a whole nother rabbit hole too. But I love your point. Like, I come to encounter Jesus. I'm healed spiritually. And after that, I pick up my bed and I follow Christ.
Yeah.
And we need to do that more often. Jesus has healed you of your sin. Are you following him? Are you being obedient to his commands? That's how we're going to end tonight. We'll pick up next week. And man, I love looking at these miracles, these signs. Now, he never called this a sign, but this is one of those miracles that John uses. So we pray this has encouraged you. Stay in tune with us on Facebook and the website and stuff for how we're going to open and all those different things from COVID-19. We pray that what we talked about tonight was encouraging. See you later.
See you guys.